Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen across the nation. Today we shall discuss a book entitled Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer, a former reporter for the New York Times who has reported from more than 50 countries on 4 continents. Overthrow is about America's more than 100-year-long history of overthrowing foreign governments that we don't like by American invasions or by American-sponsored coups d'etats. We have a long history of militarized action, some would say militarist action, usually in service of our commercial interests. And note that the long history of military action discussed by Kinzer does not even include major wars like World War I, World War II, and Korea. Kinzer sees our current actions in Iraq not as a mere aberration due solely to George Bush, but as following in train of 100+ years of similar actions and philosophy which Americans largely don't know about. Because he elaborates a long-standing foreign policy tradition that most of us are largely ignorant of, Kinzer's book is vital to anyone who wants to understand America's foreign policy today. Stephen Kinzer is here with me to discuss his book. I am Lawrence R. Valvell, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Thank you for sitting for a second interview, Stephen. I must say that I think a lot of people, whom I hope read the full book, are probably learning a great deal that they didn't know before, as I did when I read the book, and in listening to you also. In the second half of the 20th century, there seemed to be a break when, instead of overthrowing other governments by invasion, the Smedley Butler-esque type of action, we started overthrowing them in many cases by fomenting coups d'etats. And this occurred, one might say, on the watch of a fellow who's been largely forgotten now, named John Foster Dulles, and then another person who had an enormous impact on American foreign policy subsequently, 20 years later, was Henry Kissinger. I'd like to discuss each of those individuals before we discuss things like Iran, Panama, and other times when we overthrew governments. Tell us, if you would, about John Foster Dulles, who he was, his background, what he did professionally, what his worldviews were, and what his views were as Secretary of State.
John Foster Dulles was a fascinating figure, and I really think he, as you say, he has been a little bit underestimated in terms of his importance. I think that he set patterns for the United States, which we followed for almost all of the second half of the 20th century and even up to the present day. Dulles was a corporate lawyer in New York with the firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. That was the most powerful multinational law firm in America, and Dulles was the most powerful and most highly paid international lawyer in the United States. The list of the clients of Sullivan and Cromwell is more or less a list of all the big multinational corporations of the period of the mid-20th century. Everything from the International Nickel Company to the Cuban Sugarcane Company to the Haitian Railroad Company to the United Fruit Company. Dulles's clients were digging ports in Brazil and opening banks in Saudi Arabia, mining in Colombia. They were all over the world. So he developed this idea that the most important thing the United States should do in the world is make sure that American companies could work freely. That was his idea of what the U.S. government should be doing. And by the time he became Secretary of State, he was already well past 60. His worldview was very well formed. In addition to his experience as a corporate lawyer, he also had another aspect of his personality that I think was very important, and that is religious aspect. Dulles's father was a clergyman. When Dulles was a kid, he used to have to go to Mass every day, 3 Masses on Sunday. He had to memorize 15 lines from the Bible and 1 psalm every week. His grandfather was a missionary who had been buried in Ceylon, in what now Sri Lanka. For a time, he was considering becoming a preacher and actually did become an elder in the Presbyterian Church, a trustee of Union Theological Seminary. So he was also shaped by a particular kind of religious belief. And
Can I ask you a question? Didn't he have a grandfather also who was Secretary of State whom he used to accompany?
Absolutely. John Watson Foster, after whom John Foster Dulles was named, was actually the Secretary of State who helped organize the overthrow of the government of Hawaii 50 years before Dulles came into office. So Dulles came in with a sort of silver spoon. He came from a family of great privilege. His religious belief, I think, led him to conclude that the world was divided between the good and the evil, and that, as he once put it, there are people who are good and Christian and believe in free enterprise, and then there are the others.
Yeah.
Dulles fervently opposed any kind of compromise with those that he considered America's enemies. Dulles had actually been quite friendly with Nazi Germany. As a lawyer, he spent a lot of time in Germany. His law firm represented some of the major firms that supported the Nazi regime right up until until about 1942. He only left Germany because the other partners in the firm insisted on it. So he never really saw a danger in Nazism, but he saw a huge danger after the war in communism. It was communism that he built up as the ultimate evil in the world. And, for example, he was against any negotiation with any communist country. He was against cultural exchanges, even with the Soviet Union. He fought for years to prevent US newspapers from sending correspondence to China. He believed that evidence of agreement with the Soviets on any subject was bad for the US because it was just a ruse to get us to let our guard down so they could come in and hit us. So Dulles came into office with this very Manichaean good-evil view of the world. And there were also a couple of other very interesting factors about the era in which he emerged in the early 1950s. The first has to do with something you mentioned in your introduction, and that is big change in the world that had occurred that made it impossible for the United States to overthrow foreign governments by invading the way we had been doing it in the past. And what was that big change? It was the emergence of the Soviet Union. Now there was the Red Army that functioned as a kind of counterbalance to the United States. And if we invaded some country, this risked provoking a Soviet reaction which could spiral way out of control.
And Chinese communist reaction
Absolutely.
after 1950.
So we were looking for a new way to overthrow governments, and that was when Dulles decided to turn to the CIA. In addition, I think you have to put yourself back in that era and realize that many Americans got the feeling that communist power was on the march, and we were losing. Don't forget that the communists took over in China. They almost took over in Greece. The Soviet Union developed a nuclear bomb. We had the Berlin airlift. We had the takeover of Eastern European states by the Soviet Union. A whole series of events, including the Korean War, led us to believe that we were being surrounded. Now, from the Soviet point of view, considering its history, the idea of wanting to take the states in Eastern Europe as buffers made sense. It didn't look that way to us. But the Soviets didn't have the interest in, say, taking over countries in Latin America. We didn't believe that, though. We didn't realize that at the time. We had the feeling that everything that happened in the world that was bad for the U.S. or bad for an American corporation must have been part of a plot that was formulated in the Kremlin. So Dulles came into power with this belief, as he had stated during the election campaign in 1952, that the United States needed to go out and roll back communism. And that became kind of the leitmotif of his time in office.
If I may interject, that was a disgrace, like Kennedy's claim about a missile gap was also a few years later, because there was no way that we militarily were going to roll back communism. And he said Truman was soft on communism. This is the guy who went into Korea by himself without a congressional declaration, and he's soft on communism.
Well, the odd thing was that Dulles came to believe that the only way the United States could roll back communism was to attack countries that in the end were not really communist. As you said, it wasn't realistic to think that we could attack real communist countries like China or Soviet Union. So once he came into office, he was faced with this reality. We need to roll back communism because that's what we promised to do. But where are we going to do it? And so instead of focusing on countries that truly were communist, we focused on countries where there were nationalist leaders that were bothering big multinational companies. We decided that if they were doing that, they must be communist, so that could be our target.
Right, right. You know, people tend to forget that in addition to places like Iran, Dulles was largely responsible for what happened in Vietnam, because the Americans would not participate in the Geneva settlement. And in '56, when there were supposed to be elections to unite the two halves of the country, we're the ones who persuaded the South, don't do it.
Actually, there's a wonderful story that I tell in my book about Vietnam. You're absolutely right. So in 1954, there was a conference held in Geneva in which, following the withdrawal of the French from Vietnam, a decision was made that Vietnam would be temporarily divided into a North and a South, and then 2 years later, there would be an election in the whole country, and then the country would be united under whoever won the election. It became clear as 1956 came closer that the winner of this election by far would be Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist. He was the nationalist leader who had overthrown the Japanese, who had fought the Japanese during World War II and had overthrown the French. So he was the George Washington of Vietnam, and certainly would have been elected president, as even Eisenhower publicly admitted. So I have this scene in my book, which I find absolutely fascinating, in which the person we had selected as the interim president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, has sent a cable to Dulles. And the story is actually recounted by a guy who was in the room when Dulles is reading this cable. And he said, I remember distinctly the clock ticking the seconds away on the wall as Dulles read this cable. And finally he looked up and said, I don't think Diem wants to hold this election, and I think we should support him on this.
Yeah.
So the whole beginning of the crisis that led to the Vietnam War began with the decision of the United States, which was actually the decision of John Foster Dulles, not to follow the agreement that had been reached in Geneva and allow the unification of Vietnam in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And what happened in the end? If we had allowed Vietnam to become unified as the treaty had agreed, we would have had a unified Vietnam under communist rule. Instead, we fought a 20-year war, we lost 50,000 Americans, and millions of Vietnamese were killed. And what was the end result? Unified Vietnam under communist rule. We had the same result.
Yeah, exactly so. All right, we'll come back in just a few minutes for more on these fascinating subjects with Stephen Kinzer.
Taking the first step towards your legal career can be an overwhelming task at many other law schools. Lucky for you, the Massachusetts School of Law is not one of those schools. Applying is easy. No LSATs required. Scheduling is flexible with daytime and evening classes, and learning is remarkably rewarding since all of our professors have real-world experience. All of this and much more at the most affordable law school in New England.
The Massachusetts School of Law. Your future starts here.
One of the things that's really fascinating about Dulles, as you describe him, that is particularly fascinating in view of the contemporary stress on teamwork, is you say Dulles was a man who communed with himself to make decisions, went into a room and thought by himself, would go home at night, have a couple of drinks, and think by himself every night. And this is how he made decisions.
Even the assistant secretaries of state didn't know what Dulles was thinking. It used to be said that he carried the State Department in his hat.
Right.
And, you know, I have a particular quirk, as I think a lot of people who are interested in history do. I like to go to the actual places where history was made, rooms or fields or places or edifices. I have put my hand on the door where Martin Luther nailed his 93 Theses, and I've been in the room where Dostoevsky wrote his great works. When I was making a visit to Texas, I discovered something quite remarkable, and it is that the living room of John Foster Dulles' house, where he used to sit and have his drinks in front of the fireplace, and although no one knows what he was thinking, we assume he was planning these overthrows of foreign governments, has actually been taken in its entirety out of the house where it used to be, and is now a museum exhibit in a library in Austin, Texas, on the campus of the University of Texas. So I was actually able to go into that room, and you actually see there's the drapes, and there's the furniture, and there's the fireplace, and there's all the little knickknacks, and the books, and the souvenirs, and his little jade collection, and gifts that he had been given by foreign leaders. And I was looking at that chair and thinking, John Foster Dulles was sitting in that chair, looking in that fireplace in this room when he was plotting the overthrow of governments like Iran and Guatemala. So much of what changed the world came right out of this room.
Yeah,
That was a very moving experience.
Yeah, startling. They're redoing the Anderson Cottage where Lincoln spent a lot of time, and I think one will get some of the same feeling. In fact, it's open now, I understand, after having been redone. All right, that's Dulles, a most unusual character in American history. Henry Kissinger, what kind of a person was he, and what was his worldview all about? Did it comport with the traditional American worldview?
Kissinger, of course, was born in Europe. He was a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. And I think he did not grow up with the appreciation of American democratic principles that many Americans grew up with. He drew from World War II, I think, two lessons that many people in his generation drew, and I think they have both been tragically misapplied. Those were the lessons of Munich and the lesson of Pearl Harbor. The lesson of Munich is never negotiate with your enemy. It's only a trick. And the lesson of Pearl Harbor was no matter how quiet you think things are, there could be somebody out there plotting to destroy you, and he's going to bomb you with no warning. So you better go out there first and hit him.
Yeah.
So these were parts of the Kissinger mentality. Kissinger was also very much a product of the European diplomatic tradition. He wrote his thesis at Harvard on Prince Metternich, who was one of the greatest practitioners of big power diplomacy. Kissinger had this idea that the U.S. should project its power in the world through a series of regional allies. In every part of the world, we should have one country that was big and powerful, and we would arm that country. We would support its government, regardless of what that government did. We would allow it to be as repressive as it wanted, as long as it would allow us to use that country as a base from which to project our power. That became the Congo, later Zaire in Africa, Indonesia, and Iran, where during the Shah's rule certainly was a part of that. Now, there's one very interesting difference between Kissinger and Dulles. Dulles had spent his entire life in the service of corporate power. Kissinger actually had no interest in and almost a kind of a disdain for business and for economic interests. And I think this shows you that there's an interesting process that happens when Americans carry out these interventions. The first phase is always that some company gets in trouble in some foreign country, and then the leaders of that company come to Washington and complain and ask the U.S. government to do something about it. Yeah. But the U.S. government and the leaders of our country, and Kissinger is a classic example of this, do not overthrow foreign governments only to protect American businesses. They convince themselves that any government that would bother a big American or a big foreign corporation must be anti-American, anti-democratic, repressive, brutal, probably a tool of our enemies, and therefore it must be overthrown not because it bothered this American company, but because the fact that it would do so means that it's a political and strategic threat to the U.S. So this is how Kissinger was able to convince himself, for example, that the reason he was directing the overthrow of the government of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973 was not because Allende was nationalizing the copper industry. He was not doing this to protect the big copper companies, Anaconda and Kennecott. He was doing it because Allende had proven, by the fact that he would want to do this, that he was a strategic enemy of the United States. So he convinced himself that he was acting for political rather than economic means, something that Dulles never had to do. Economic goals were enough for him.
Well, we always act in the name of higher principle, allegedly. We always think of the worst possible case, and we always assume the worst possible case will happen unless we do something right now. Most recently, this is called preventive war. We're going to a short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back with a discussion by Stephen Kinzer what happened in Iran with Mossadegh, the British, and ourselves in the years late 1952 and really 1953.
From day one, I knew I took the right step.
The Massachusetts School of Law is challenging.
But you feel welcomed and supported at every turn.
You're learning the professional skills you need to get hired.
From professors with real-world experience.
Trust me, that makes a huge difference.
I now have a job I love. And the best part is, I'm not in debt.
No LSATs required. Teachers that make a difference at the most affordable law school in New England, the Massachusetts School of Law. Your future starts here.
Welcome back. Why don't you tell us now, if you would, Steve, about the Iran situation?
The first thing that we need to understand when looking at Iran and what happened in Iran in the early 1950s is what has always been the central fact of life in modern Iran, which is that Iran is sitting on an ocean of oil. This is what makes Iran an important country in the world. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, the British, through a corrupt deal with the former emperor of then Persia, as it was called, took over the entire Iranian oil business. What it meant was that all the oil that was produced in Iran, all the oil that was refined in Iran, all the oil that was exported from Iran was the property of one single British company, owned mainly by the British government. So
that was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Exactly, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Now, it meant that while Iran had this huge resource, its people were living in some of the worst standards of living to be found anywhere in the world. And the benefit of Iran's oil wealth went exclusively to Britain.
As I understand it, Britain paid a pittance to Iran for the oil, a pittance especially in comparison with the fact that other countries, oil companies, were paying something like 40 and 50% to countries whose oil they were taking.
Actually, the British agreed to pay about, I think, 12% of the oil revenues to Iran, but there was also another catch to that. First of all, the oil company was heavily taxed in Britain. Now, it was owned by the British government, so these taxes were essentially going from one hand of the British government to another hand. But the company was able to claim that that was taxes, so that shouldn't count as part of the sum from which the Iranians should get 12%.
So it was net revenues.
Net, and they jiggered the net so that it would be very low. And in addition to that, there was another provision which was that no Iranians would be allowed to look at the books. So they just had to take the British officials' word for what 12% was. And as you say, around the same time, in the late 40s, the United States first went into the oil business in Saudi Arabia, and their deal was 50-50 split. 50% of the money for the country that has the oil, and 50% for the country that has the technology and does the investment to extract it. But the British were never willing to make that kind of a deal. So this was this great contradiction. The entire standard of living that British people enjoyed during the 1920s and 30s and 40s was a result of Iranian oil. That's what powered all the factories in Britain. Britain has no oil. Britain has no other colony that has any oil. The Royal Navy, which projected British power all over the world, was fueled 100% by oil from Iran.
That would be one of the major reasons, maybe the major reason, why Hitler wanted to get Egypt into Suez?
Well, that was one of the reasons, and it was one of the reasons for the Battle of Stalingrad, because it was in Stalingrad that the Nazi army was stopped on its way to Azerbaijan to capture the oil fields of Azerbaijan and northern Iran. Oil has always, through the 20th century, been the key factor in the politics of the Middle East, and I think Americans have now even gotten to the point where they realize that when American leaders say this is not about oil, if it's in the Middle East, it's about oil.
Subnam, Kuwait, and Iraq.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, in the period after World War II, the winds of nationalism and anti-colonialism were blowing through Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And in Iran, nationalism meant one very obvious thing. We got to take back control of our oil. And we have to use the wealth that our oil represents to develop our own country. And we shouldn't allow it to be sent somewhere else for the benefit of people in another country. It was this national obsession with taking back control of the oil that lay under Iranian soil that led to the election of Mohammad Mossadegh as Prime Minister of Iran. Now, it's hard to believe today, but Iran at that time, in the period after World War II, was a functioning democracy with a variety of political parties, a functioning parliament, constitution. And actually, when Mossadegh took power in an election by the Iranian parliament, before he agreed to accept the job of prime minister, he pulled a paper dramatically out of his pocket and he said, "This is the law to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. First pass this, then I will accept becoming prime minister and my job will be to implement it." And that law was passed unanimously by both houses of the Iranian parliament. So,
by the by, at the time, the British, because they thought it would help them, had nationalized their own coal and railroad industries.
Exactly, but what they thought was appropriate at home was not appropriate for other countries to do.
Yeah.
So the British were suddenly faced with the loss of their biggest, most important, and richest foreign property. They tried a variety of means to overthrow Mossadegh. First they tried to bribe him. They tried to assassinate him at one point. They brought him to the UN Security Council, which refused to condemn him. Then they brought him to the World Court, which also refused to condemn him. They blockaded the port through which Iran would export its oil, so that even if Iran could produce any oil, it wouldn't be able to sell any. The British technicians who had worked for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and wanted to stay in Iran and continue working for the nationalized company were forbidden to do so and all pulled out by the British government. Mossadegh told the British very clearly, "I don't care if we can't produce any oil or if we can't export any oil. We'll just leave it in the ground. We'd rather do that than let you continue to have it." So the British finally decided they had to overthrow Mossadegh. And they ordered their secret agents who were operating undercover in Tehran to do so. But Mossadegh found out about the plot, and he did the only thing he could have done to protect himself. He closed the British embassy, and he expelled all the British diplomats. And among these diplomats were, of course, the secret agents who were plotting the coup. So now the British had nothing, and they were in a real panic. The election in the United States at the end of 1952 that brought Dwight Eisenhower to power, and with him John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State, sent a surge of excitement through the British Foreign Office and the British Secret Service. They thought that maybe now we can get the United States to reverse policy and agree to carry out the coup. They had originally asked President Truman to do it, but Truman had refused. So that left them with nothing. But after this election in 1952, they thought they could change the Americans' minds. And ultimately, they did manage to do that by telling the Americans, we don't want to overthrow Mossadegh because he took away our oil company. They knew that this argument wouldn't move Americans. They said, we want to overthrow Mossadegh because he's leading Iran toward, of course, communism. That was the buzzword, and that got Dulles suddenly fascinated. This was the country that he could then use as the explanation for how he really had carried out his campaign pledge to roll back communism. Now, Mossadegh was an elderly aristocrat whose mother was a princess and who actually despised all socialist and Marxist ideas. But that was just a little detail. The Americans made the argument that it's true he wasn't a communist, but he could die or he could be overthrown and there could be instability and that could lead to a communist government emerging in Iran. So the United States did go in and overthrow in a covert operation that actually took only a few weeks, the government of Mohammad Mossadegh.
Now this was done by a guy who was a grandson of TR named Kermit Roosevelt, who was head of the CIA operations in the Mideast at the time. Is that right?
History delights in these little jokes, and sure enough, it was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt who helped bring America into the regime change era, who was responsible for overthrowing the Mossadegh government in the summer of 1953. Now, let's look back at what happened as a result of our overthrow.
Tell what he did, about bribing everybody and their brother. And I love the story about the two people who didn't want to do it, and he said, I'm going to kill you right here if you don't take my $50,000 and do this.
The story of how Kermit Roosevelt was able to overthrow Mossadegh really illustrates to me how easy it is for a rich and powerful country to throw a poor and weak country into chaos. It was the same technique that was used a year later in Guatemala. Essentially, Kermit Roosevelt came in and bribed a lot of newspaper editors and reporters to start publishing terrible articles about Mossadegh. He bribed religious leaders, mullahs, to denounce Mossadegh from their pulpits as an atheist. They bribed members of parliament, bribed police and military commanders, and suddenly there seemed like there was a huge wave of anger against Mossadegh in Iran. But all of this had been artificially fomented. And he had these two Iranian agents who he used to hire street gangs. And at one point, as you said, they decided they'd had enough. It was getting too dangerous. And he told them they had a choice. Either if they continued to help him, he had $50,000 in cash for them. If they didn't want to help, he would kill them right on the spot. So that's a sort of a persuasive argument. And one of the things that I thought was so brilliant about how Kermit Roosevelt did this was he did one thing that would seem reasonable. I would have thought of that too. And that is, through these two Iranian guys, he hired one of the main thugs in Iran to put together a gang of toughs and violent people and run through the streets, destroying mosques and breaking shop windows and yelling, "Up with Mossadegh! We love Mossadegh!" Then they would beat people, break windows, destroy mosques. But what he did was even better than that, was he hired another mob to attack that mob. Essentially, this gave the impression to the people in Tehran that the situation in Iran had gotten totally out of control and Mossadegh wasn't able to control the country anymore. But not only was one of these mobs controlled by the CIA, they both were. So all of this together resulted in the overthrow of Mossadegh. And again, it was a case of the openness of democracy gave the Americans the ability to create this sort of artificial anti-Mossadegh climate. Now, after overthrowing Mossadegh, we placed the Shah back on his throne.
This guy was not exactly a brave guy. He said, I'll issue certain things, but then I'm getting into my plane and flying off to somewhere else.
And this was actually sort of a surprise to me as I was researching this episode. I remember the Shah during his last years, and he was a very authoritative, strong, self-confident person. It was only when researching this book that I realized that actually in his earlier years he was a totally scared pipsqueak and a little mouse who was afraid of his own shadow. And maybe, ask your psychiatrist friends again, it was to compensate for this fact that he put on this bravado in his later years. The Shah ruled with increasing repression for 25 years. His repression produced the Islamic Revolution of the late 1970s. That revolution brought to power a clique of fanatically anti-American clerics who spent the last 25 years
if I can interject something.
Undermining American power.
If I could interject something here. He created an organization called Savak, which was as bad as the NKVD or Hitler's gangs. And the only place, as I understand it from your book, the only place that where people who dissented could find an outlet was in the religious schools and the mosques.
You're absolutely right. There was no such thing as an opposition political party or a trade union movement or independent student groups or any kind of civil society. If you wanted to be against the Shah, the only place that was open to you was the mosque. And that is how the opposition became so heavily influenced by religion. So we helped create that situation. That, of course, helped lead to the explosion of discontent in the late 1970s. And that brought to power this regime that we are now confronting so threateningly in Tehran. It tells me again that if we had allowed Iran to continue on its democratic path, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these 50 years. Instead, we created a whirlpool of instability, and great threats to America have emerged from this place and from this maelstrom that we ourselves actually created. This government that's now in power in Iran, that is so directly confronting the United States, would never have come to power had the United States kept its hands off Iran in 1953.
Yeah. All right, we'll come back in just a few minutes for more on these fascinating subjects with Stephen Kinzer.
Stuck in a cubicle, Jess was going nowhere. Carol made the switch from a tech company. Everald was an undergrad who knew he wanted more. He deserved more. Find your future at the Massachusetts School of Law. Immerse yourself in a fun, supportive campus environment. Learn professional skills from instructors with real-world experience. Take the first step in changing your life at the most affordable law school in New England, the Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Your future starts here.
My understanding is that we were at a complete loss in 1979, a period I remember, to understand why they were taking over our embassy and why they hated our guts. And that, of course, ruined Jimmy Carter's presidency.
Yes, it did.
And even more importantly, perhaps, it was a success of the fundamentalists in Iran, I gather, which led to the rise of fundamentalism elsewhere and to the initial jihad against the Russians when they invaded because of Afghanistan, because of a fear that Afghanistan was turning, they had a communist leader, but they were afraid he was turning fundamentalist.
It's certainly true that the effect of the takeover by Muslim radicals in Iran was felt way beyond the borders of Iran. A lot of these jihadist groups or Muslim extremist groups in other parts of the Islamic world had been functioning off in the corners of mosques and never thought of themselves as being able to seize power in an entire state. It was the example of Iran that made them think, wow, we can take over a whole country. We don't just have to keep talking to ourselves in cafes. So that was something I think that did inspire Muslim radicals all over the world, including those in Afghanistan who went on to form the Taliban.
And then I gathered that when we decided, and they sent Bearden over there to arm the Mujahideen. What was his first name? Gene?
Milt Bearden.
Yeah. We channeled all the aid through Pakistan, which made sure that it went to the fundamentalists in Afghanistan.
It was another example of wanting to achieve a short-term goal and not thinking about what the long-term implications were. We actually printed millions of Qurans and distributed them to these jihadist fighters and encouraged them to believe that they needed to fight against the infidel invader. And they naturally, after having overthrown the Soviets, didn't change their mind about this. It's just that we then became the infidel invader.
And so from that came Afghanistan, came the whole movement for Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda were people whom we had trained, or who got trained because of Afghanistan, let's put it that way. And the essence of the whole deal is that what we did in 1953 is bedeviling us today.
When I started out to write my book about Iran, a book called All the Shah's Men, it's about this 1953 episode. I remember thinking to myself, I might write a better book than this or a book that sells more copies than this, but I'm never going to find a story that was so hugely important in shaping the world that's so unknown.
Do you think, so unknown is a real key. You may not want to answer this question. I wouldn't blame anybody who doesn't want to answer this question, Steve. Do you think we owe the Iranians an apology?
I think we owe them more than an apology. We owe them some help in trying to climb out of the terrible pit that they're in. What I would like to see us do with Iran now is open up a real dialogue with its leaders and see if we can't reach some new kind of global accord with them. You know, the United States and Iran are not only not fated to be enemies forever, we actually have many strategic interests in common. We want to see a calm Middle East, certainly a calm Iraq, because it's right on the border of Iran. We both want to see oil flowing freely out of the Middle East towards the West. The Iranian oil industry is really in a shambles. It needs billions of dollars in investment. That investment can practically come only from the United States. Iran hates the radical Sunni movements like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They hated those movements even before we had discovered them. They're not so friendly with Arabs either, as the case with us. So we have a lot in common with Iran. You know, when we started our opening to China, we did it in what I think was a very sophisticated way. The first document that was signed between the Communist Chinese government and the United States was something called the Shanghai Communique. And that communique was the beginning of the process of normalization. All it was a list of all the issues that the two sides disagreed on and needed to discuss. So this, I think, would be a great start for us with Iran. Let the representatives of the United States sit down and tell the Iranians all the things we don't like about them. And then let the Iranians tell us all the things they don't like about us. And let's make a list of all of our differences and then agree to negotiate them. It's not going to work to try to negotiate just on the one issue that we care about, which is their nuclear program. I think they would be willing to negotiate that, but only if we are also willing to negotiate some of the issues that they're upset about. So I think there is the possibility for us to calm this crisis down diplomatically, but the United States, I think partly because it is still psychologically scarred by the overthrow of the Shah and the hostage crisis, has not been able to make the leap towards agreeing to sit down unconditionally with the Iranians and discuss all these questions.
It's curious, as we sit here taping this show, there has been some kind of an agreement apparently to engage in some kind of discussion with the Iranians and the Syrians, and that in itself is a breakthrough, I guess, because until then we were adopting, George Bush and Dick Cheney were adopting the John Dulles position. We will not talk to people.
It's a very odd view that we should not negotiate with people that hate us. Who else do you negotiate with? You don't need to negotiate with your friends. You only need to negotiate with your enemies, the ones that hate you, that you hate, that are killing your children. That's what negotiation is all about. So this idea that certain countries are disqualified from negotiation because of the way they behave, I think is crazy. It's the fact that they behave that way that makes it so urgent for us to be in dialogue with them.
All right, we'll come back in just a few minutes for more on these fascinating subjects with Stephen Kinzer.
Earning your law degree shouldn't burden you with overwhelming debt. At Massachusetts School of Law at Andover, we believe it should be affordable, achievable, and yes, even an enjoyable first step to your successful career. We believe in an atmosphere of support, flexible class scheduling, and hiring professors with real-world experience, ensuring you leave law school with the professional skills you need. We are the most affordable law school in New England, and we believe in you.
The Massachusetts School of Law. Your future starts here.
Welcome back. Steve, let's talk about Chile. What happened in Chile? Who were the dramatis personae? An all-star group of evil people, in my judgment. and why did it all happen?
First of all, Chile had, at the time we became interested there in the early 1970s, one of the longest democratic traditions in Latin America. This was not some banana republic ruled by military tyrants. This was a country that had more than half a century of strong, uninterrupted democratic rule.
Amazing.
And over the period starting in the late 1950s, Salvador Allende had been one of the leading politicians in Chile. He had been president of the Senate. He had run for president several times. He was totally at home inside the Chilean political establishment. He was a leftist. He was a Marxist. But he was also very much in the Chilean political club. He was even a Mason, which is not so common for Marxists. Third generation Mason, actually.
Yeah.
So what happened was that in 1970, Allende was running again for president. And the United States decided to do something that it had never done before, which was try to overthrow a leader before he even got elected president.
That's called preventive something or other.
It was, yeah, preventive electioneering. So we poured a lot of money into the Chilean election, and we were not successful, and Allende did emerge as the leader. Then, during the period of his, before he was inaugurated, we made a number of efforts to try to overthrow him. Why did we do this? There were several large American corporations working in Chile. Most famous was ITT, which was very involved in the project of overthrowing Allende. But actually, the industry that was for Chile what oil was for Iran and what banana production was for Guatemala was copper. Chile is the world's largest copper producer, and copper is a vital resource for the world. The Chilean copper industry was dominated by two giant American companies, Kennecott and Anaconda. It was Allende's idea that these companies should be nationalized and that the wealth and the profits from the copper industry should be used to develop Chile and not be sent out to foreign corporations. Now, one of the principal businessmen in Chile, a guy named Agustin Edwards, was also the publisher of the main newspaper in Chile, and he happened to be, among his many other business interests, the director of Pepsi-Cola in Chile. Now, I don't know if you know this, but during the period when Richard Nixon was out of office, from the time he left in 1960 to the time he was elected in 1968, he was the international lawyer for the Pepsi-Cola company. So he got to know the Pepsi-Cola network, and he knew Agustin Edwards very well. Edwards was an extreme right-winger who hated Allende, and when it became clear that Allende was going to become president, Edwards flew to Washington, and he went and actually met with Henry Kissinger and other senior officials in Washington and told them that Allende was a terribly dangerous communist who was going to destroy American power in Latin America. And it was actually Nixon who made a very interesting comment during this period. He said, "I will never support a policy of weakening the military in Latin America. The military is a power center that is subject to our influence. The others, the intellectuals, are not subject to our influence." So here again was a classic
And
case.
they were subject to our influence because?
Because many of them had been trained in the United States, and the military's ideas of how to run countries coincided with what the United States thought was best in these countries. Bear in mind, although we like democracy in our own country, in the countries that we deal with traditionally, we have preferred authoritarian rule. It's more predictable. You're not going to have strikes. You're not going to have any kind of unrest. It can all be easily repressed. If there are dissidents or anti-American movements, those people can be killed or thrown into jail. That's why military-run regimes are often preferable for us.
A lot of this, by the way, was taught at something called the U.S. Army School of the Americas, where these people went, wasn't it?
And some of it is still being taught, as that school still thrives, having been moved from Panama now back to the United States. So this situation that happened in Chile was that President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State, became obsessed with Allende. And although he had been democratically elected, and although nobody suggested that he was going to try to overstay his term in office, and all the candidates that were lining up to succeed him were more conservative than he was, the Americans decided they couldn't wait. They had to overthrow this guy, and it wasn't only because he was trying to nationalize the giant American copper companies. As I said earlier, it isn't the economic motive that American leaders believe is pushing them into action. Nixon actually said this in one of his meetings, that the big problem with Allende is that if a Marxist who is anti-American is allowed to succeed, this is going to send a terrible message through Latin America. We must make sure that Chile is in chaos during the time that Allende is in power. Otherwise, other countries are going to think that they can get away with this. And sure enough, it was the Americans and Nixon who said, I want you to make sure that not a screw or a bolt gets into Chile. So we launched an unofficial embargo. American companies stopped sending spare parts to Chile. At one point, a third of all the taxis in Santiago, the capital, couldn't work because they couldn't get any spare parts. Bank loans dried up, international aid dried up, and sure enough, Chile was thrown into chaos.
We more or less ordered people like Exim Bank and World Bank, stop the loan.
Exactly. So we succeeded in our goal of throwing Chile into chaos, and then we actually sent weapons into Chile, and we were in direct contact with military conspirators, and we made it clear that we wanted Allende overthrown. We worked with the plotters, and on September 11th, 1973, Allende was overthrown. There's one very interesting fact that ties together the 4 coups that were carried out by the CIA. That was Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, South Vietnam, 1963, and Chile, 1973. And that is that the CIA station chief in the country had to be fired before we launched the coup because he was against it. Now, our CIA station chief is supposed to be the person that we pay to know the most about this country, even more than the ambassador. The ambassador is just dealing with diplomacy. The CIA station chief is dealing with reality, is supposed to know everything that's going on above the surface and under the surface. In all 4 of the cases where the CIA overthrew a government, the CIA station chief sent notes back to the United States saying, don't do this. This is not going to be in our interest. And so the answer from Washington, great, you're fired. We're sending someone in who's for it. So we didn't even trust the judgment of the people we paid to be the greatest #1 expert on this country. And what these CIA agents saw that we didn't want to accept was that these operations can succeed in the short run, but in the end, they will not only result in unhappiness and misery and repression in the target countries, but they will also undermine the security of the United States.
Yeah. All right, we'll come back in just a few minutes for more on these fascinating subjects with Stephen Kinzer.
Growing up, I didn't think law school was an option because of my educational background and blue-collar upbringing until I was introduced to MS Law. MS Law provided me with the real-world law and practical skills to be a trial attorney. I am a trial attorney today because of MS Law, which helped me find my passion.
No LSATs required. Teachers that make a difference at the most affordable law school in New England. The Massachusetts School of Law. Your future starts here.
What happened in Chile after they overthrew Allende? Who, by the way, was killed. These people are always killed when we sponsor these coups.
The regime that followed Allende was a military regime. So again, we had an elected leader replaced by a very harsh military tyrant, General Pinochet. There are now, today, 25,000 Chileans on lifetime government pensions as victims of torture under the Pinochet regime. And of course, they were among the lucky ones because thousands also were killed under torture and in other ways during the Pinochet regime. So there really was a reign of terror in Chile during the 1970s. And Pinochet remained in power for a number of years until finally people voted against a plebiscite that he had staged to try to extend his period in power. And Chile, I think, although it's now returned to its democracy, has still not gotten over the trauma of what happened. And interestingly enough, the woman who is now the president of Chile, President Bachelet, lost her father during the coup. Her father was a military officer who refused to support the coup and was killed. And she herself was held in a prison for a number of months after Pinochet took over. It was a prison where, it was a women's prison that was famous for multiple rapes of all of the people that were inside that prison. She herself has never spoken about what her own experiences were, but one can only imagine the horror that she went through. So we now have a regime in Chile like the one that we probably would have had right after Allende, and it would have spared Chile terrible pain. The other thing that it would have spared is the hatred and the opprobrium against the United States that exploded all over the world. This is an example of how these operations create terrible anti-American feelings in the world. And we are now involved in a worldwide conflict in which having the most soldiers and the most advanced weapons is not enough, like it always used to be in the past. If it were enough, we would have won the war in Iraq already. What we need in this global conflict we're fighting now, the one most important weapon is information. We need to know who's out there. What are they planning? What are they plotting? What are they doing? How do you get information? You get it from people, individuals, intelligence agencies, but they only share their information with people they respect, with people they want to share it with. And we have cut ourselves off by our actions in the world from the sympathy of the world population, and through that, from the information that we desperately need in order to triumph in this conflict.
How do you explain the fact, which I gather is a fact, that in each case there were all these American governmental meetings, Vietnam, Chile, Guatemala, Iran, and there never seems, and despite what the CIA station chiefs said, there never seems to have been any dissent. And in fact, you talk about one meeting, I think on October 24th, 1963, about Vietnam, and it says, okay, that's what we're going to do. Nobody sure it's a good idea, but hey.
I think there is a thing that we call groupthink that takes over. People understand what the leader wants. Everyone understood that President Nixon was fixated on overthrowing Allende. Everyone understood that President Bush was fixated on overthrowing Saddam. Therefore, rather than try to challenge entrenched assumptions, the coterie of sycophants around these leaders only presented opinions that supported the ones that had already been reached. So any kind of intelligence information that contradicted what people understood had already been decided was systematically pushed aside. And the people around the president served him and the nation very poorly by insulating him from dissenting points of view.
I don't know how you say it in French. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
If there's one silver lining to the Iraq debacle, maybe it will be that, at least for a while, Americans will be a little more reluctant to get involved in these projects and a little more hesitant to believe that the United States, because it's so powerful, can achieve anything it wants in the world.
Well, you know, we all hope you're right. And on the other hand, I have to say, after Vietnam, who would have thunk it? Who would have thunk it? Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much.
That was great.
Thank you very much. To the audience, I hope this was very informative about subjects which the American people desperately need to be informed about. Be with us again next time. Thank you.